Good afternoon. On behalf of the Urban Institute and the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center, I'd like to welcome you to a discussion about tax policy, the 2024 election, and a look ahead to 2025. My name is Joe Rosenberg. I am a senior fellow at the Urban Institute and the Tax Policy Center. I'd like to start with a few notes of housekeeping. First, the event is being recorded and will be posted online afterwards. Full speaker bios are available online. Third, we'd like to engage with our online audience. Please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box at any time to engage with us online. Or you can engage with us using the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. Finally, we at TPC are always looking for ways to broaden the conversation on tax and fiscal policy. We are especially interested in hearing from more voices representing a variety of perspectives, backgrounds, and experiences. After today's event, we'll be emailing a link to a survey. If there are topics you think we should consider for future events or speakers you would like to hear more from, we ask that you share your feedback in the survey or by emailing us at info@taxpolicycenter.org. So let's get started. We have two panels for you here today. The first, it is my pleasure to welcome three distinguished tax experts to the conversation. Kimberly Clausing of the University of California, Los Angeles, Day Manoli of Georgetown University, an affiliated scholar at TPC, and Kyle Pomerleau of the American Enterprise Institute. As I mentioned, their full titles and bios are available online. Thank you all for joining us. The 2024 election cycle has been an unusual one, and tax policy is only one issue that voters will consider when they go to the polls next month. It was exactly 3 months ago, on July 21st, that President Joe Biden announced he was withdrawing from the race, and Vice President Kamala Harris officially became the Democratic nominee on August 2nd. Last month, Vice President Harris released a document outlining her economic agenda. On the tax side, she proposes more generous tax breaks for lower and middle-income workers, families, and small businesses, and higher taxes on wealthy households and corporations. Harris has reiterated that she will ensure that no one earning less than $400,000 a year will pay more in taxes, but has not said exactly how she would deal with expiring tax cuts. Meanwhile, former President Donald Trump has made extending those expiring tax cuts that he signed into law as part of his 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, most of which expire at the end of next year, a main component of his tax agenda going forward. Over the past several months and weeks, he has proposed an array of additional tax cuts, including exempting tips, overtime pay, and Social Security benefits. But Trump's agenda isn't all tax cuts. He's also proposed imposing additional tariffs on U.S. imports, particularly those from China. So with that as backdrop, I want to turn to our panelists. And I want to begin with what, sort of regardless of the outcome of the election, will almost certainly be the top tax issue of 2025, and that is those expiring tax provisions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, or TCJA for short. So I'll start with you, Kyle. You recently published a paper summarizing what we know about the TCJA. Tell us what you found and the implications that you see that having for the debate over the next year.
Yep. Thanks, Joe, and thanks for having me. This will be a good discussion. So I think before jumping into what we know or what we don't know about the effects of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, so I think it's important to take a step back and maybe frame this as what were lawmakers trying to accomplish with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. This can kind of get lost in the back and forth over whether the TCJA paid for itself or some of the more outlandish claims. So prior to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, I think lawmakers agreed that there were several large shortcomings of the tax code. They felt on the individual side that the tax rates on workers and non-corporate businesses were relatively high. They were also concerned about individual code complexity. Lawmakers were also concerned about the corporate tax code that was out of date and out of line with the rest of the developed world. So next year, the decision is what to do about the expiring provisions, which is generally the individual provisions. There are a few business provisions that they will also need to debate whether to resurrect or to expand. And then there's also decisions about what to keep in the tax law. So, what do we know and what should lawmakers' takeaways be from the current research? So I got three takeaways. I know there are more, but I'll focus on three. So the first is that lawmakers should take fiscal sustainability seriously. I think the research is pretty unambiguous that the 2017 law reduced federal revenue. Regardless of how you measure it, the law reduced federal revenue in 2018 and 2019. Things get a little bit more complicated in 2022 due to the pandemic, subsequent legislation, and inflation. Regardless, if you look at CBO's revenue projections now and what we're collecting, and if you adjust those for inflation, they actually align quite nicely with what CBO thought would occur after the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So I think lawmakers should expect that any extension is also going to reduce federal revenue. Second, some newer evidence suggests that the tax law did produce some positive economic effects, but those effects were far more modest than some of, say, the Trump administration suggested. So I think for several years, we've saw many studies that attempted to measure the economic effects of the tax law, looking at national accounts data, several finding few obvious effects. I personally don't find these studies super compelling. It's very hard to isolate the effects of a single law when several other things are going on at the same time. More recent evidence, however, is doing a little bit more careful research, and they're finding positive effects, particularly of corporate tax reductions on corporate investment. Now, this has several implications, but perhaps the most important one, and the one that relates to the first point, is the budgetary implications. Reducing taxes can increase output somewhat and offset the cost, but it's not going to be enough to offset it meaningfully in any way. So lawmakers need to take whatever conventional score is given to them seriously, because you can't really rely on very significant dynamic effects. And then the last piece is, regardless of what you think about the evidence on growth or the budgetary implications, the law did accomplish some other goals that are worth, or they made some improvements that are worth maintaining. So for one, the tax code is simpler for individuals. For example, a third of filers earning over 200,000 used to have to deal with the AMT prior to 2018. Now it's only about 1% of that population. And then it also improved economic efficiency in a number of ways, leaving aside its effects on total investment. For example, it reduced the dispersion of effective tax rates across assets and across forms of financing. I mean, one of the concerns prior to the TCJA was the bias in favor of debt-financed investment in the corporate code. That was reduced drastically from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And that's something that lawmakers should probably build on rather than discarding.
Great, great, Kyle. Thanks. I mean, you mentioned some of the features that the TCJA was originally designed to tackle. So, Kim, I want to turn to you. Kyle mentioned some of the changes on related to the taxation of corporations and especially multinational corporations. Could you share a little bit with us about what the TCJA did and how you see it affects playing out?
Thanks so much, Joe, and thanks to TPC for organizing this great panel. I think one place to start in thinking about the corporate and international provisions is with Kyle's insight that we really need more revenue. We're starting with high deficits right now over the coming decade, exceeding 6% of GDP, a full extension of Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, including reversing the business provisions that are getting more harsh over time, could easily make that number more like 7.5 percentage points of GDP. So we're going to need revenue. We've had politicians restrict themselves with various pledges. Luckily, corporate is space, I think, where there is room to get revenue, and one can do it in a relatively efficient and progressive manner. And I think one can learn from Tax Cuts and Jobs Act more about how to do that most productively. So I only have a few minutes, so let me also just say that this is covered in more detail in recent Journal of Economic Perspectives papers that both Kyle and I have in the recent volume. And I also have a recent short piece that came out with Center of Budget last week. So Tax Cuts and Jobs Act had a big corporate tax cut. It's quite clear that reduced revenue from the corporate tax. It was also accompanied by really important international reforms. In international tax, there's a real balancing act between the concerns of companies themselves that worry about competitiveness and the concerns of protecting the corporate tax base. And so how they handled this balancing act is they basically went with a relatively revenue neutral international provisions if you set to one side the one-time deemed repatriation tax. And that didn't really leave anyone content. Businesses still worried. There still seemed to be a lot of profit shifting going into low tax jurisdictions. And so I think there's still going to be a really healthy debate about this. When we look at the consequences of the legislation in terms of revenues, corporate tax cut clearly reduced revenues. The international provisions, again, are more nuanced. I think GILTI came in with more revenue than we thought. That's the minimum tax on global income that's averaged. FDII, which is the export subsidy, was more expensive than many people thought. There are ways to make those provisions raise more revenue. Penn Wharton has just done an analysis that shows there's a lot of revenue on the table there. But even absent changes in the law, the planned increase in the GILTI and FDII rates, according to Penn Wharton, will bring in over $400 billion over the coming decade. So there's a lot of money to talk about here. Turning to profit shifting, there's some evidence in the last year or two of reduced profit shifting. I think it's hard to fully separate the effects of Tax Cuts and Jobs Act from other things that are going on in the data. And in the last year or two, the most important of these is the International Tax Agreement, which is really changing worldwide the incentives for multinational companies to have income offshore in low tax jurisdictions, because some country is going to top that up to 15%. And so I think we've seen that agreement is already helping protect the U.S. corporate tax base, whether or not we fully comply with it. And so there's been some progress in the last year or two, but there's still a disproportionately large amounts of income in these low tax rate countries. And there's still a big tax preference for foreign income relative to US income, despite, politicians' claims about wanting to be America focused in their policies. We kind of have a tax code that is preferencing foreign income relative to domestic income. Turning to wages and investment and growth, I think the puzzle that Kyle points out is that the macro aggregates don't really show a lot of effects, but we do have some micro studies that are showing positive investment effects. My takeaway from that literature is that investment is more effectively encouraged from expensing than from corporate rate cuts, and that the downsides of crowding out from higher interest rates associated with deficits may very well overwhelm the additional positive effects associated with investment inducements here. So I think it's going to be a really interesting time ahead. I do think there's space to raise corporate revenue in an efficient and progressive manner. And I say efficient because I think we should recognize that a lot of the corporate tax base overlaps with the tax base on rents. And so Congress, when they're thinking through these things, should be sort of balancing the revenue needs, the fairness question, and the efficiency question alongside this international profit shifting motive.
Great, thanks. I want to circle back to this question of what role corporate and international might play in next year's tax debates. But before we do that, I want to thirdly just turn to today and ask if you could give us a sort of overview when pivoting to sort of the child tax credit and the benefits we provide for families with children. Could you tell us a little bit about what the TCJA did as far as that goes, and where what we sort of have heard on the campaign trail about both what Vice President Harris is proposing and former President Trump?
Sure. Thank you very much, Joe, for having me, and and I'm very happy to participate on the panel with everyone else as well. But so happy to talk about the child tax credit and TCJA. I think as Kyle mentioned, kind of to set the stage here. There was a lot of simplification of the tax code, and the elimination of personal and dependent exemptions was part of TCJA in 2017. And at the same time, this was sort of a significant expansion in the generosity of the child tax credit, going from $1,000 per child to $2,000 per child. And I think this was a pretty significant step in setting the stage for current debates about the child tax credit, in that this was a significant expansion in the generosity of the child tax credit. And on the campaign trail, I think both the Harris campaign and the Trump campaign have campaigned on expansions, or even more generous expansions to child tax credit benefits. So while we've talked about fiscal sustainability and sources of additional revenue potentially on the corporate side, I think that the child tax credit is somewhat on the opposite extreme, in that I think that there could be pretty transformative expansions and expenditures in the child tax credit. So increasing the child tax credit, kind of in the vein of the ARP expansions of the child tax credit, has been, I think, some of the campaign promises or proposals offered by the Harris campaign. And kind of thinking of maybe more in the vein of earlier thoughts about like cash assistance, but providing sort of uniform $5,000 credits for per child have been proposals from the Trump Vance campaign. So each of these would significantly increase expenditures. I think that there are concerns about fiscal sustainability already, and I think there might be even more concerns about that as well, kind of going forward. So evaluating the child tax credit, I think, has been very much a focus in that policy itself. But thinking about this in the larger fiscal puzzle or fiscal kind of landscape could be particularly important. I also think it's particularly important to think about the child tax credit in the domain of other tax benefits for working families, such as the earned income tax credit, and thinking about the interaction between the EITC and the child tax credit. Are these unwinding some of the employment incentives that were offered by the EITC by offering child benefits even at zero income levels? Does the evidence about phase outs from the EITC speak to maybe that would have limited impacts from the CTC phase outs? All of those are sort of interesting questions, I think, to think about. But generally speaking, the campaigns have kind of been proposing large expansions to the child tax credit that I think also need to be thought about in terms of what would be the sources of revenue to cover those expenses. So happy to elaborate on that. Kyle, I know that you might have some thoughts, so I'm happy to welcome your thoughts on thinking about some of these domains as well.
So I think that provided a really good overview and summary. I think we heard a number of things that I want to sort of think about. What if you look ahead to a lot of these tax cuts expiring next year, and 2025 providing this sort of opportunity to either double down on things that TCJA did well, or again an opportunity to either go broader or in a slightly different direction. So Kyle, you mentioned individual simplification. Kim, you mentioned taxation of corporations and multinationals as potential and an opportunity for more revenue. And then we've heard about the sort of the child benefits, and in particular the larger benefits we saw in 2021, and a lot of bipartisan interest there. But I might sort of turn that question back to you all. And as you are looking ahead to what issues Congress is going to have to deal with and the administration next year, regardless of the outcome of the election, what is sort of one area that you would like to see with respect to sort of the TCJA framework, Congress to take another look at? And I'll let anyone jump in.
Well, I think we'd probably all agree that they should rethink 199A. I'm guessing that nobody's a big fan of that in the tax expert area. That's the pass-through income deduction. I think Kyle's right that there's a lot of simplification benefits from Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that should be saved, including the AMT and this higher standard deduction. I think I'll put one advert down that kind of combines Kyle and Day's interests, which is, I believe Kyle with his co-author suggested helping to fund an expanded CTC through a carbon fee. I think that would be a very creative thing for Congress to use to sort of pay for some of the more expensive things they want to do and sort of recognize the commitment to meeting our Paris obligations. So that's one thing I think would be a nice addition to that debate as well.
And I'll jump in here too to, repeat what everyone said here, that, I think lawmakers really do need to concentrate on the fiscal implications of extending the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Simply $5 trillion additional dollars of borrowing is not sustainable. I think there are places in the individual code, business tax code, and outside the current tax system that could all be used to offset the cost of this. One thing I'll agree with Kim on here is that there are places in the corporate code, for example, that can raise revenue. Now, I would rank the rate lower than Kim, and I would go after interest deductibility, the state and local tax deduction for corporate income taxes, and general business tax credits before I would go after the rate. But that is a place where revenues could be raised. And then on the individual side, I agree 199 Cap A needs a revisit at the very least. Lawmakers can continue to go after itemized deductions. And then if to give rate reductions, that's one of the single largest reductions to redistribute the benefits of the tax cuts in almost effectively any way they'd like, as long as they're creative enough to look closely at that.
Yeah, and just to echo some of this, I would really kind of revisit TCJA, but with the lens of fiscal sustainability, as Kyle and Kim have highlighted. I think that adding to the fiscal sustainability, Joe, I think in your previous employment, thinking about Social Security and Medicare, thinking about payroll taxes, those are also now in the budget window, in the 10-year budget window. And I think that fiscal sustainability of Social Security and Medicare are also some significant components. So it is, I think now through the lens of multiple dimensions of fiscal sustainability, or multiple layers of fiscal sustainability, that we are now revisiting a pretty transformative tax cut. As elements of Kyle and Kim have highlighted, there are elements that we want to preserve that were, I think, maybe good policy kind of making in terms of tax simplification and gains in efficiency. But we're now sort of facing a different fiscal landscape than I think people had in mind at that time. And so we are revisiting a big piece of legislation through a really different lens.
Great. I'm sure we will pivot back to TCJA, but let me use this as an opportunity to shift the focus to some of the ideas that we've seen throughout this presidential campaign. And so all of you have talked about the importance of keeping in mind the U.S. fiscal position. One idea we've seen, and therefore looking for additional sources of revenue. One of the ideas that especially former President Trump has advocated for is increasing tariffs. So Kim, maybe I'll start with you. You've written about this. He has said he would impose large, significant tariffs, maybe 10%, maybe 20% on all countries. On China, maybe as high as 65 or 60% or higher. What impact would tariffs have at those levels on businesses, U.S. households, and is that a good way for the U.S. to look for revenue?
Yeah, for an economist, that's an incredibly easy question because this is unquestionably a very bad way to look for revenue. And I think there's a reason, if you look at countries throughout the world, that no rich country and most middle income countries don't rely on tariffs as a source of revenue. And so what candidate Trump is suggesting here, I would point out, is a huge and unprecedented increase in tariffs. All the rates that you just talked about applying to all the imports across the board is really substantially different from what we saw in his first administration. If you look at the first administration tariffs, they fell on about $300 billion worth of imports from China. Firms and customers were able to pivot to other sources of imports. If you imagine instead putting tariffs on $3 trillion worth of goods imports, which is a little less than what we import right now. And you don't have the ability to substitute away because there isn't intergalactic trade yet, right? So that would be a much bigger shock and really unprecedented. If some people say, well, you know, Biden and Harris have suggested new tariffs too, but in comparison, the new tariffs that have been suggested in the Biden-Harris administration have been 18 billion, which is about 1/200th as much as we're suggesting here. So the scale is very large. Effects on consumers would be dramatic. You don't have to rely on my report, although I have some. If you look across the board at all the different groups everywhere from Tax Foundation to Center for American Progress, they're all suggesting that this would cost households thousands of dollars, between $2,000 and $6,000 is roughly the range. And by my estimation, I think this would be quite a regressive tax. And one way we can see that is, especially in the short run, who's paying it? It's the people who are consuming, right? If you're relatively well off, you might not spend very much on imports. And if you're lucky, the tariffs will go away before you get around to spending your money that's in your savings account, especially if tariffs of this magnitude will realize the mistakes we've made. But if you're poor and you're spending all your income, you're going to have a higher hit from these tariffs. We might say, well, maybe it's worth it to pay these thousands of dollars as consumers because it will help us as workers. It will create this industrial renaissance. And that's kind of the argument that the Trump campaign is making. But it flies in the face of economic research. And there's been several good studies of Trump's first round of tariffs. And those tariffs cost more jobs than they created. There was an undiscernible effect in the industries that were protected, and job loss occurred in the export sector because of retaliation. And also manufacturing was hurt by the fact that you're disrupting supply chains. And the final reason why this is a very bad idea is that we live in a very unsafe world that's filled with global collective action problems, from climate change to pandemics to security. And I can't think of a quicker path to alienating each and every partner and ally that we have in the world than threatening them all with tariffs of this magnitude. So I think this is one of many terrible ideas, right up there with deporting workers and challenging the independence of the Fed, that could lead to really negative, harmful effects for the U.S. economy. And I hope voters will take that seriously, because it's been made quite clear in Trump's own words that he intends to follow through on these suggestions.
Can I agree with Kim and then pile on some other reasons to dislike this policy? Kim brought up retaliation. So retaliation from foreign governments should also go into how we view the costs of this policy relative to its benefits. So taxes, they'll raise revenue, but they will have some sort of economic cost. With retaliation, that's an economic cost the US is going to bear, but with no revenue. In fact, that might reduce revenue from retaliation. And then secondly, if you enact a tariff, that's going to make it harder for foreigners to export stuff into the United States. That's going to reduce the supply of dollars in the world. That's going to have two effects. One, it's going to immediately make exports more expensive from the United States, and that's going to be a hit to the income of exporters. We don't even need to rely on foreign retaliation to know that this is going to harm exporters. And then secondly, and something that hasn't really been discussed, is when you enact an import tariff and the dollar appreciates, that is going to transfer wealth from Americans to foreigners. And the reason this occurs is because when the dollar appreciates, the value of assets that Americans own overseas are going to be worth less after having to convert back to the US dollar, where foreigners, they're going to get the benefit of an appreciated US dollar as they convert that back. So the opposite of what Trump suggests here, this is actually going to make the US poorer, not wealthier.
No, thank you. And I will note there's a couple things popping up in the chat. One is a link to work that both Kim and Kyle did in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, which was noted along with an event that the Tax Policy Center co-hosted at Brookings last month, and also some work on tariffs. I mean, well, I mean, unless Day, you want to advocate for tariffs here, I guess why don't we? So I think there's sort of been we're not seeing tariffs as or we're not hearing a lot of support for tariffs as a solution to the U.S. fiscal problem. The other trend, big picture trend in the campaign is, and it's not entirely new in presidential campaigns, and I've been in Washington for a number of them, is to, on the campaign trail, offer very targeted tax goodies to specific constituencies or voters. And we've seen that from both candidates. So I don't know. I mean, maybe I'll start with Kyle, but anyone, is this? I mean, I guess, how do you think about when there is a good case for a targeted tax subsidy or tax preference? And in particular, if you think any of the proposals out that have come up during the campaign have merit, or just as importantly, are likely to have legs going into next year?
So, yeah, as you mentioned, there's been a handful of these proposals exempting Social Security benefits, tips, overtimes, auto loan interest, lower tax rate for manufacturing. And I think you're right, too, that these are not new. But what I think makes them notable is that a lot of these coming from Trump is someone that signed a tax bill back in 2017 that was supposed to move away from this sort of tax policy and more towards a broader base, lower rate system. And overall, evaluating these, I'd say most of them are just straight up bad. Now, while you could make a narrow case for some of these in certain contexts, for example, a deduction for interest expense is a completely legitimate deduction to have in a pure income tax system. So you would allow a deduction for auto loan interest. I think that there are reasons not to like this. One is that the sum total of all of these provisions is going to reduce federal revenue by more than $2 trillion, on top of the 5 that we're already on the hook for. And it's a general reversal of important tax reforms that have occurred since the 1980s. Now, you may not think that all of the tax system currently is coherent, and some of these might be part of a coherent system, but they're not being paired with the other reforms that would be necessary to make these make sense in our current system.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think a lot of this has the flavor of candy being given out to try to lure voters. Even recently, the suggestion that police and firefighters wouldn't have to pay tax, or military or veterans. Some of those sound appealing to someone who's not stopping and thinking about it, but it's just an unaffordable sort of an unachievable set of promises in my view. The one thing that I've heard emphasis on in this campaign that I was somewhat heartened by, if there is one thing, is this emphasis on the supply of housing and what we can do to increase housing supply. I think some of that has come out of the Harris campaign, and I think the idea of building more homes and tying tax incentives to that, or to improvements in state and local zoning, has the potential to address some affordability issues for middle class Americans and lower class Americans, people who are struggling to make their rent. So I think those are promising, but this long laundry list that Kyle just mentioned is completely unaffordable. And if I were a voter, I wouldn't count on any of it happening either.
Yeah, I just want to dovetail on Kim's highlighting of the housing elements. I think it is kind of really very difficult to kind of see like the long laundry list as being feasible, especially in this through this lens of fiscal sustainability that we've talked about. But when some of these policies are really aimed at kind of underlying economic concerns, like, or fundamental concerns like the housing crisis, or potentially thinking about like other credits to address housing supply, I think those can be pretty fundamental. So thinking about expansions to the low income housing tax credit, and also I would highlight the TCJA and opportunity zones, and thinking about place-based credits that could expand housing in targeted locations. Those could be potential tax credits that, again, there's significant expenditures, not on the revenue raising side, but those could kind of have some legs going into 2025.
Mhm. Great. Joe, I'm gonna take at least a partial question that was entered into Q&A online from a viewer, and that has to do with whether it's one of these sort of targeted tax incentives, or even whether it's something we saw that was a revenue raiser in the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act. These difficult provisions, what it means for the IRS and tax enforcement in general. So even despite additional funds, Day, you've done a lot of work on tax administration and the impacts on taxpayers. How do you think about sort of the importance, or the need to be mindful of the requirements on the IRS and how they administer the tax system and deliver benefits to households?
Yeah, I think that a lot of our discussion here has kind of highlighted this theme of continuing to use the tax code to achieve both redistribution, but also a lot of different social assistance or kind of social spending programs. And, I think that's due to a variety of factors, but it does create this administrative kind of challenge for the IRS, especially in an environment where IRS funding has been limited. We've seen pretty transformative investments in the IRS with the Inflation Reduction Act. I think that there's been a lot of impetus to try to improve taxpayer experience, whether that's hiring individuals for call centers, trying to think about tax enforcement through audits. I think there is limited ability for the IRS to hire very skilled accountants. So some of the high income tax enforcement could be pretty challenging. But overall, I think that as we think about administering these social programs through the tax code, it is really critical to think about IRS modernization. That's everything from the ability for the IRS to monitor documents coming in, have the capacity to process and respond to taxpayers, and administer many complex tax credits on the business side for housing, climate, et cetera. So I see IRS administration or tax administration as really critical in 2025. I think that this was a really significant component for the Inflation Reduction Act, but I would probably imagine that further investments in the IRS could be even more specific, or even more specific in targeting areas to improve IRS service and administration, in addition to thinking about the fiscal sustainability of the tax code. Kyle, Kim, definitely welcome your thoughts here on this as well. But I think that those are really critical questions for 2025.
I know we have limited time, so we can go on, but IRS funding is of course on the ballot, and it's really important that the IRS has the money they need to do their job.
Yeah, we've already talked about a couple of the events beyond just expiring tax cuts that are likely to play a role next year. We've heard about the international, the OECD developments that could force action. The fate of the additional funds for the IRS, and potential agreements related to the child tax credit. Again, this is an election event. So as voters head to the polls, or maybe they're early voting already, what is one issue that you think, and I'm just going to kind of throw this open to anyone, that voters, that voters and the press have not paid enough attention to in this election cycle, and sort of we'll stick to the topic of tax, but you think voters should particularly be mindful of?
I'm happy to kick it off. I think the deficit and debt question is something we've already talked about, but is hugely important, and that people should be cautious about embracing wishful thinking from either the right or the left on this topic, because we're going to have some hard choices to make in the time ahead. I think the good news is there is some low-hanging fruit. There's some places to raise revenue in a pretty efficient manner. Another issue that I think we could always spend more time on is the sort of big fiscal switch that Trump is proposing here by eating away at the income tax, and particularly the progressive parts of the income tax, things that disproportionately benefit those at the top, which many of his suggestions do, including the corporate sphere. And we're not even taxing capital income at all at the individual level for 75% of US equity income, roughly. So I think shifting from progressive income taxes to inefficient and regressive tariffs, I think that's something that all of us should pay close attention to from both an efficiency and a tax fairness lens.
We've touched on this a little bit already, but the issues of tax simplicity, complexity, there's the potential that things could get worse with respect to the tax code under certain outcomes of the election. We've already mentioned things like the exemption for tips, exemption for overtime. I mean, these at a high level, you get it that those are benefits you want to provide to certain voters. But if you think about how is this going to be administered, that's when it really can go off the rails very quickly. Tips, that's just another form of compensation. There's going to be pressure on the tax system and the IRS once you zero out the tax burden on one form of income, but keep it positive on another. We already have places in the tax code where this is a big issue, like the taxation of pass-through businesses with respect to self-employment taxes and the net investment income tax. It's something that could get worse and actually have an impact on tax filing, having to jump through hoops if these are ultimately enacted.
Thank you. You're on mute. So
Yep. So I think just very quickly, I would kind of jump in and kind of mention long-term elements related to affordability and like the care, thinking of care credits for both elderly dependents as well as younger dependents. But also payroll tax reform. I think thinking about subjecting capital gains to payroll taxes could be pretty significant, in terms of Social Security and Medicare. And then, I would also kind of come back and kind of think about like the broader fiscal sustainability and potential like transformational sources of revenue with thinking about, carbon taxes or thinking about wealth taxes. Those are potentially transformative in fiscal sustainability, but also potentially on the ballot.
Great. Well, thank you. And so thank you to Kyle and Day. And thanks to Kim for joining us. She had already agreed to start her class late, so she had to run to go teach. Again, thank you for joining this conversation. And I'll separately note there is additional information about the candidates' tax plans available on taxpolicycenter.org. In addition to the information that has been shared through the chat. There was a mention of housing policies, and I think there's a really nice piece on the Urban Institute website at urban.org about the candidates' housing policies. So at this point, I will thank you, Kyle and Day. We are going to pivot to our second panel. And for that, I'm going to introduce my colleague and turn it over to Tracy Gordon. Thanks.
Thanks, Joe. I'm Tracy Gordon. I am co-director and acting Robert C. Posen director of the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to our second panel, taking a broader view of how tax policy debates might play out for the remainder of this year and in 2025. We are fortunate to be joined by two experts with deep experience on the Hill and around Washington. You can access their bios online at the event webpage, but for now, I'll just provide a brief introduction. Sage Eastman is a senior Republican strategist at Melman Consulting. He was previously senior counselor to the House Ways and Means Committee, where he worked on tax reform, among other issues. Archie Siddiqui is a partner at Aiken. She was previously senior advisor to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, where she worked on tax, trade, innovation, and healthcare, including the Affordable Care Act. So the last panel gave a nice overview of some of the big tax and economic issues the candidates are not addressing in this year's presidential campaign. The biggest item on the to-do list for any new administration and Congress is going to be scheduled expiration of nearly all the individual income tax provisions of Donald Trump's signature Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, or TCJA. TPC has estimated that tax burdens for the average household would go up by about $1,900 a year, or 1.8% of after-tax income, if those provisions expired, with bigger increases concentrated at the top. And as our previous panel discussed, CBO had said that keeping TCJA in place would add another $4.6 trillion to the deficit over 10 years. And before they even get to TCJA, Congress will have to deal with the end of the current agreement to suspend the federal debt limit, which expires on January 1st, 2025. Happy New Year, everyone. On top of all of that, the enhanced premium tax credits that were made possible under the 2021 American Rescue Plan and then extended by the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act also expire at the end of next year. But as my Urban Health Policy Center colleagues have pointed out, that insurers and consumers need a decision sooner so they can start making plans about what markets they're going to go into and at what price and whether or not they want to purchase that health insurance. So obviously everything depends on the results of the election. And the two guests that we have here, they are going to tell us just what's going to happen. So let's take the easy one first. Former President Trump has said that he would extend all the expiring provisions of TCJA, although he's since indicated that he would uncap the state and local tax deduction, one of TCJA's big revenue raisers. So Sage, if Donald Trump is president and he has Republican control of Congress, is it all smooth sailing from here, or what happens next?
Well, Tracy, first, thank you for having me. And second, what about Republicans in control signals smooth sailing? I'm just kind of curious if you've been watching something differently. Archie and I were on a panel a few months back now. I can't remember. We were asked, well, what could go wrong if, Republicans were in total control of DC? And I said, well, Republicans is what could go wrong. And I still think there's some truth to that, right? There's a lot of factions. There's, I know our last panel was ending talking a little bit about sort of the debt and deficit concern. So, sort of what is the number we're all going to try and write a tax bill to? I think that's going to take longer to figure out. The Senate seems to be in a little different place than the House Republicans are these days. And, I'm not quite so sure we know yet where a Trump administration might land in terms of that final dollar number. Do we all count existing policy? Do we use a current policy baseline? That can help you. Do you go to some temporary issues, right? But I think the biggest, actually, out of the gate issue will be what number is either party, if either party is in total control, right? Using reconciliation, what is that number you're running up to? I think people forget that the $1.5 trillion number we wrote to in 2017 really was almost, 6-7 years in the making. That was not a quick and easy, we just got done with, the failed attempt to repeal the ACA, so quick pivot and let's do this in 3-4 months. There had been conversations about that for years. And even that 1.5 number was not easy to get to. So I think that'll be the first big stumbling block a new Republican trifecta would have to tackle.
Let me go to Archie. If it's a Democratic President Harris and a Democratic Congress, is this a chance for fundamental changes to the federal government and how it spends on things like housing? Is our last panel.
So I think a Democratic sweep invokes a lot of different things. I think a robust debate will be first and foremost. I think there will be. I think both parties, view these sweeps as opportunities to do big things. But I think the big change that we're dealing with, and this was referenced in the last panel, probably in a significant way, but I feel like as we get further and further down the track, it's going to be even more looming, is the deficit issue. So I think certainly the policymaking exercises of the last 4 to 5 years, I don't think are good analogies of where we will be, because of, well, two factors: not only the deficit, but the fact that we're talking about a very big number when you talk about these extensions. So I don't want to take over the whole panel in terms of kind of what this scenario would look like, but I think there are a couple of kind of pieces here. Is that it'll be a robust debate. I think there's two models that you would see in something like this. Is that either the White House would take the lead on really laying out a package and working with both the House and Senate to kind of align on what that looks like. And when you're looking at the reconciliation number, you really have to work backwards to get that number. And so you kind of need to know where you're headed in terms of the package. So that's one. And two, I think, is the baseline. So there have been some interesting comments on the Republican side about what that baseline looks like, but that's another way to address some of these fiscal challenges. But I think on the Democratic side, deficit will be first and foremost. And then I'll lead with kind of some of the other piece of a Democratic sweep is that I think in that scenario, President Harris would really want to lay out a vision and kind of put her stamp on what she is coming, kind of the mark of her presidency, and nothing I think comes closer to an economic package. So I think that will be something that will set the tone in Washington and will set the parameters of debate. And I think Democrats in Congress will want to be supportive. They will see that their interests are aligned with the president's. So I think that is the bright spot of kind of the moment. And then I think the more challenging aspect will be the fierce debate, I think, within the party on what that looks like.
So getting to that fierce debate part, Sage, what if I complicate the picture that I drew earlier? We've got divided government. Which provisions of TCJA do you think are likely to survive and which are going to face a tougher time?
Boy, in divided government, I'll be provocative and say everything survives. Now, the less ambitious part of that is, because I think we're probably leading more towards a punt. I think it's going to take the two parties more than 12 months to sort of figure out how to compromise on all the varying pieces, right? And I think if you get to at some point in the fourth quarter, maybe late in the third quarter, and you don't have significant process in terms of, how does a Harris presidency work with a Republican Senate, or how does a Trump presidency work with a Democratic House per se, I think you're going to finally have to realize, like, we may have to start thinking about an extension. And I don't think the extensions this time around are quite as easy as they were, say, at the end of the Bush extensions, right? Where you, for the most part, you just had some real headline rates, a couple of headline rates, and a date attached to those rates. This time, there's just a lot more complexity around some of the phasing out, the already expired, the phasing in, the about to phase in, right? So there's a little bit more complexity around that, and how much time would a Congress want to buy itself, right? I do. You know, I love to think of Congress as rarely finishing before a deadline, but sometimes afterwards. And this is sort of in that sometimes afterward, but they've got to build more runway. And you know, whether that's 3 months, is that 3 years, that gets to be a really complicated thing that, you know, I'm going to need a few more cups of coffee to think through. But I think in the short term, you've got to buy more time than 12 months for the two parties to come together.
Archie, what do you think about that, more than 12 months?
Well, I do think, I think the big assumption that Sage is making is that, is that there'd be some sort of extension, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, so,
Ultimately, right. You take more than 12 months to rewrite it, so you'd buy yourself more time.
you kick the can down for a little bit. Yeah. So I think under that scenario, that is fair. I would just say, and I think Sage referenced this, but I would just amplify this to the nth degree, is that I think that this is not the same exercise as extending the Bush tax cuts. I think that there was more buy-in in terms of what those look like. The TCJA frame is not a Democratic frame. It's not a Democratic approach. I think when you look at the key Democratic players on tax policy, they really did want a bipartisan process. They weren't at the table. So I think when the starting point to TCJA, I think we can all, I think both parties will agree on the middle class tax cuts, but you know, for obvious reasons, the high income tax cuts are important to small business and other Republican constituencies. So I think that creates a little bit, it just creates more of a challenge. And so I would say that this is it's very unlike other extensions that Congress has negotiated on bipartisan basis. It's certainly doable, but I think if we were looking at extension world, I think the easiest thing would be the middle class tax cuts, and I'll turn it to Sage, but Sage, is it fair to say that would not be enough on your end?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's an easy way that it would not get through. And you know, the pass-through business piece, I think, would cause a lot of problem. I also think, you know, some of that also, you already start thinking about an election year ahead. I know it feels terrible to mention the 2026 elections when we've not even finished 2024, but right, where are the vulnerable members? You know, and Archie, as you know, you've got a few soft spots on some of those, you know, districts, right? Because they're higher income districts. There are a lot of pass-through districts, constituencies. You've got some agricultural issues that'll start to play into for some of your rural Democrats, assuming there are some still left in the Senate after this cycle. I don't mean that to be partisan, just an honest question as to how many are left. So again, that gets to, I think, where you and I both are, which is just how complex even an extension is, if it's not just a straight, hey, give me 3 more months and we'll figure it all out.
Exactly. And I think that's exactly right. So I think that's where that gets, and then the question becomes, you know, what can you do? Now, I do think the kick the can down the road also helps on cost and kind of does give a little bit more time to calibrate. So I think that is a very real scenario.
So Archie, you said this is sort of not the Democrats' frame, and yet Vice President Harris had said that she would extend all the expiring provisions except for households earning less than $400,000 a year. How is she going to get that done?
I mean, I think on the middle class tax cuts, I think absolutely. I think there's alignment across the Democratic Party. But did I understand the question correctly, Tracy?
Well, are we calling that middle class? Sorry, I just wanted to.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I guess it's whether you're what frame you're coming from. I would say that I do think that the Hill will back a President Harris on the $400,000 piece of that. So yes. So I guess it depends on what vantage point. I apologize.
Okay, and then so that obviously brings up this question of how much of this is paid for, given the backdrop that was talked about in the last panel. Do you guys think that they're just going to, if they're, kick the can down the road? Is it also very tempting just to punt on the federal deficit, or is that just not tenable given the current fiscal environment?
I do think
Are
that
sure.
they're going to be pay fors. So I think that there is going to be an effort. I think deficits are going to rear their head and they're going to cast a big shadow. So I think there's two ways you address that. One is with the baseline, right? There's some pieces that you can probably address in the baseline. And then the second piece of this is our pay fors. So from my perspective, I think pay fors are a part of that bipartisan negotiation that would need to happen. Obviously, I actually thought it was interesting that Kim was so optimistic about the pay fors out there. I think it's going to be a challenge, to say the least.
Paige, where do you see?
Sorry, just to jump in here. I think there are a lot of pay fors, and in fact, there were a lot of pay fors in TCJA, right? I mean, the net taxes, the gross taxes were a lot bigger than 1.5 trillion in deficit, right? That was just kind of where it ended up netting out. And I often think of big tax bills as a series of bad decisions to get to a good result, right? There's a lot of tough, ugly stuff that you have to sort of decide, not necessarily things you want to do, but give you the flexibility to ultimately get the big package at the end of the day. I think that's going to be true here. I think the other thing we can see Congress playing with, Archie laid out, the baseline, which I think is absolutely right. I think the other things will be timing, right? Do you do 2 years of something? Do you do 5 years of something, right? There's a little bit of games you can play there. And I will say this, I don't think, I think it's possible even for both parties to play around with a little bit of dynamic scoring. I think the parties are still fairly far apart on that. Though I will say this, I don't believe tax cuts pay for themselves, and I've often joked that tax cuts or dynamic scoring is a lot like the local Porsche dealership doing a sale, right? I still have a really expensive car at the end of the day that I have to buy. And so you can be able to shave a few points off of something, but I think Republicans will definitely push for trying to look at what are the things that will sort of have an economic driving effect and actually lead to tax revenue. So there's a couple of games there, but at the end of the day, I think this has to come down to what is the number, and then how do you get there? And you could claim that number is zero, where the traditional scoring might say it's in the trillions, multiple trillions of dollars. I don't know yet where Congress is settled. I don't even think Republicans are settled on a number yet, let alone the two parties. I feel like Dems are a lot closer to zero than we are, but we're not to $5 trillion either. So there's a lot of room there for the two parties to come together on.
Yeah, and just as a reality check, I think the IRA green energy tax credits get brought up as a pay for a lot of the time, but that gets you only about 700. They were more expensive than people thought when IRA was passed, but that only gets you about 700 billion of the way there. So that's not a money
And that's
grab.
if you think you can really get all of them, right? I mean, there are pieces there that matter, as we saw during some of the earlier House attempts, right? There was some initial scaling back. I think we just saw the letter come out a month or so ago by about 17, maybe more House Republicans, sort of urging the speaker to take a scalpel, not a sledgehammer to those credits, right? As you start to think through some of those energy producing districts, some of those agricultural districts who are using some of the biofuels, some of the transportation industry that's looking at clean aviation, all of a sudden that gets a little tougher to do than just saying, okay, great, we're going to toss out the IRA provisions. I think as you get through this, it'll be a lot harder to do.
We've also heard some voices in the Republican Party talk about a higher corporate rate. Is that real, do you think, as a pay for?
So I think there's real pressure. I would be surprised at the end of the day if that is the first level, especially in a Republican only situation. That obviously that pressure grows as you start to have bipartisan conversations. But I think there is still a good case to be made by those in the business community to try and hold the line on that rate. And I think there's a lot of support. I think there's still, if you took a blind vote in amongst House and Senate Republicans today, I think the corporate rate would win overwhelmingly. But again, this isn't a one-off question. As I said earlier, big tax bills are usually a series of bad decisions to get to a good result. And so the question will come down to is, do they feel like that's a bad decision they have to make in order to get a bigger, better result on the whole? And I think that's a real That's a real question at this point. One, I still think the business community can win, but one they will have to play to win.
Well, I think the other really important dynamic here on the corporate rate will be the overall economic frame and kind of what is happening in the economy, how people are feeling. I think on the Democratic side, certainly there's more support for playing around with that, what that number is and what that the right number is on the corporate rate. But there are competitiveness issues, and there are other issues of if the economy feels soft or if the outlook is murky. And I think regardless of what happens and who's in power, the economy is going to be a critical driving factor. And my sense, for better or worse, is that once this election is resolved, it will be a very quick turnaround to folks, whether it's a President Harris or whether it's the Congress, about folks thinking about reelect. So I think from that perspective, everything will go through a political lens, and that political lens on the corporate rate becomes more difficult if the economic outlook is murky.
Mhm. And yet, I think in Washington, oftentimes when we're having these arguments about extending tax cuts, people do bring up the economy. And so that certainly was operative when we were talking about the 2001, 2003 Bush tax cuts in 2010 and 2012. And now that argument that the economy is weak holds less water. And so sort of the same kind of question that I asked Sage about, is this real? There are some Democrats who would say, I think Senator Warren has called it a tax doom loop, that I'm tired of getting caught in this sort of rhetorical device where we can't possibly let these tax cuts expire because of the state of the economy. I think some would argue that that's not credible in the current economic environment. How much do you think Democrats might just try to toe the line and say, let it expire? That's a perfectly fine outcome.
Well, I think the challenge is that, and there was a reason where the corporate rate was made permanent and the individual rates were not, because I think for exactly what you laid out is that there would be more pressure to address individual and small business rates. So I think from that perspective, I think it's a fair point, Tracy, but I would also say this is that I think, and it's one of the biggest challenges I think of this election right now, is that the economic numbers do not match up with how folks are feeling on the ground. So I think really, if you do look at this at a political lens, this economic frame is, I certainly respect Senator Warren's assessment here, and it is fair to a certain extent. But at the same time, what we are seeing, I think that's probably the biggest fundamental challenge to the vice president on policy, is that all of the things that she can point to in during her tenure, that isn't good enough to allay what people are feeling. So they really are looking at what this next step is. And you start with that with do no harm. That doesn't mean I'm not arguing that there won't be a change to the Democrats and on the Democratic side, and that Democrats won't push for raising the rate, because obviously President Biden has already done so. But what I am saying is that it's going to be a factor. It's going to be harder to disengage, and I think there's going to be a balancing in terms of how members and the White House look at finding that right sweet spot on what makes a competitive U.S. economy, and at the same time addresses fiscal concerns.
And Sage, thinking about the effect of tax increases on the economy, I think a lot of folks were surprised that the revenue raising provisions of TCJA that started phasing in a couple of years ago weren't rolled back. And there was a bipartisan agreement to do that made it through the House, but then got stalled in the Senate. And so I wonder, are business tax extenders from the TCJA just not a Republican priority, or is it more of a question of just not yet?
Well, I think some of the extenders are in trouble because the business community has lived without them for some period of time, right? And I think there is a very traditional conservative thought, which is we don't incentivize past behavior, right? So at that point, it is just literally handing out free money for things people did beforehand, which is great when you have it, but not so great when you don't have the money. And obviously, I don't think anyone thinks we're in great fiscal shape here in DC. Now, the one I think counter pressure to that is that Washington has for, the better part of the last 3.5 decades constantly promised that, okay, this may be a timing question from time to time, but we always do renew them. We always keep you whole. And I think there are some Republican pockets worried about, like, if we pass temporary policies going forward, do businesses start to not count on those the way they have over the last 3 or 4 decades? And therefore you're not getting as big a bang, right? If you have another R&D credit going forward and maybe it only lasts 5 years, in year 4, do companies start to hedge and maybe put that R&D in Canada or overseas, right? And so there's a little bit of a catch-22 there between the effectiveness and the cost and the retroactivity of it. But I think all of those things are in play. I mean, I think the biggest thing, and Archie nailed it from the start here, which is just the sort of debt and deficit conundrum that I think both parties face. I think they'll answer it in very different ways, but they're going to struggle to answer it, whether on their own or let alone in some sort of compromise. So all of those razors, I think, are absolutely on the table, and some things may get left behind this time around.
Rishi, I'm curious what you hear from folks about the extenders and whether they think that that was just not credible.
No, I think, well, and from what perspective, I would say that I don't think the drumbeat, and I'm curious if Sage feels this way as well. I don't think the drumbeat from those who are really pushing for these business extenders has been as intense as you might think, especially on the R&D side. So I think there is something to be said on that front. I do think when you look at the individual policies, there is a lot of bipartisan support for them. So I don't think, but I think it is an intensity issue, A, and then B, I do think it's harder in this environment to some of these things that we thought were kind of, no-brainers. They're no longer no-brainers. They all require a significant amount of energy. And I think there may have been, to Sage's point, there may have been a thinking that, oh, well, this package will ultimately get passed. And I think we see it languishing. I think there's also a dynamic here, which I think is a very real dynamic, is that if you have, when you have a bipartisan bill, for the most part, the tried and true formula is it's bipartisan and it's bicameral. And you have to have the chairs and ranking committee members of each, and we didn't have that here. So I think that was another structural challenge that made this package a little more difficult to get over the finish line. Because you look at the House vote, it was overwhelming. You don't see votes like that. It was in the high 300s. I mean, I think around 380-ish. And then if you looked at the Senate, it would be also, I think, a strong vote. But you had a ranking member who wanted to protect his jurisdiction as ranking member of the Finance Committee. And so I think that changed the dynamic in a significant way.
And so the child tax credit was obviously the other half of that deal that was struck. I wonder what you both think of that as an area of potential bipartisan agreement, and expansion, as Senator Harris has proposed, and I think Vice President Harris has proposed, as she also proposed as the senator, and former President Trump has at times also indicated support for.
I mean, I would say on the Democratic side, there is robust and complete alignment that the child tax credit is a really critical policy. And I think when you look at the record in terms of the impact on child poverty, I think it's very clear on those results. So I don't think there's any daylight in the Democratic caucus. I do, and I don't mean this in a partisan way, it has been disheartening to see over the years the support on the Republican side diminish for the child tax credit, because coming up as a younger staffer, I always viewed that as something that was bipartisan. And when I was on the Hill with the Speaker Pelosi, when we negotiated with the Bush administration on an economic stimulus package, that was part of the package that we negotiated, and it wasn't a visceral discussion. Whereas I think the child tax credit has lost some of its bipartisan patina, and I hope maybe we could get back there. I'm just not sure.
Archie, I think we can get our mojo back. I'll give you a little bit of hope.
So how serious are both parties about deficit reduction? I feel like, Sage, you mentioned that there were years and years of overlapping ideas about the need to get the corporate rate down and other areas of bipartisan agreement. So do you think that there's room for some sort of grand bargain, or how would that play out?
I think that's the real question there is what do we mean by deficit reduction, right? And are we going back to grand bargain days where we're starting to think back through and I lived through the super committee days and the Camp Baucus attempts to sort of work on some of that. Um, I think it will be hard to look at a tax bill as a deficit decreasing effort, right? I think the honest question is, how big is the negative number there? And again, we can obscure it a little bit by choosing different baselines, but in any traditional measure, I fully expect that um, the score of no matter who's in charge, is going to be less than the current law baseline would suggest, right? And it's not often we get to make Megan Trainor all about that baseline jokes, but this is one of those issues where you can start to play around with it. And so I think at the end of the day, even if it's all D's in control, we'll see a tax cut next year. And then the question turns to, can you build that into something bigger? Can you build it in a grand bargain? I know there are Republicans who have talked about doing some of this, even within a tax bill. If they have reconciliation, are there things they can do on the spending side to help do offsets? I am highly skeptical that when those realities sort of come out and the scores come out that a single party can do both tax and spending at the same time to tackle the deficit. I think that is something that still has to be done in a bipartisan fashion.
Archie, how about you? You're a veteran of all those grand bargain days as well.
Well, I think the question is an interesting one because I would actually put it, I think we haven't spent a lot of time talking about this today, but relationships matter, as we well know, in terms of policymaking. We have on the Democratic side, it's just a wholesale change in terms of the members who are now in office, and they approach things differently. So I think there's that kind of X factor. The other piece I would also say is a lot, I think, depends on kind of the ecosystem, kind of the group we've gathered here today. Is I think the outside kind of think tanks, organizations, all of those pressure points, I think they will be critical in terms of highlighting this, just because in this political environment, it is a lot easier to focus on the here and now. I will say that I think there is a growing recognition that what happened in COVID and what's happened in the IRA and these other pieces, it's a very different dynamic going into this next Congress. So I think deficits will be important, but I do think that when you think back, some of the members that have been so critical in driving those messages and kind of, I would say, creating a balance within the Democratic caucus, I think that has shifted. So the open question is, do we have a new generation of members coming up and really highlighting that as a real concern and as a real protection kind of long-term on the economic front. And I fully expect that to happen, but I do think it would be a mistake to not realize that the cast of characters has changed, A, and B, when you look at the leadership decks, that's changed as well. So those two factors, I think, does put a disproportionate importance to a lot of people who are on this call in terms of whether it's education, whether it's data, whether all of those pieces are going to be critical.
How about the lame duck session that's coming up? Do you think that anything's likely to happen there?
Sage, why don't you kick us off?
I was gonna say we're both waiting to see who wants that one for another one. I am skeptical. There are a couple of theories around an incoming administration, you know, obviously wanting to hit the ground running, and so can you sort of clear the underbrush out and provide a clear pathway for a new administration. The problem I have right now is you're, you know, I think we're all but guaranteed a change election, right? At a bare minimum, you know, the most status quo election still has a change in the administration, right? Okay, you keep the parties, but it's still a change in the administration. Okay, maybe in that situation you can see some clearing. Um, uh, but almost in any other circumstance, you've got to figure out, well, why does this, you know, why do House D's want that, but why do Senate R's want that? Where's the Venn diagram that gets them together in terms of an interest? And maybe you throw the debt ceiling in there and you can sort of start getting some more interest and stuff. But that feels like a lot for this Congress to swallow. And I think the last time we did sort of a big clearing. Archie, was almost probably Speaker Pelosi, and we did what the caddy tax and a whole bunch of other stuff real fast and furious at the end. And I just, to me, I have a hard time believing that there's going to be much more than the must-do items that get done, right? So, you know, we've got to figure out how to fund the government somehow. We've got to figure out how to do NDAA. There's some healthcare extenders in there that are really important, especially, you know, at the community level. But there's not a ton else that's really driving stuff. And I think we'll probably be more like in a repeat at the start of the last couple of administrations where we're spending the first quarter more cleaning up the last year than we are trying to sort of initiate the first 100-day agenda.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would say that it is a very steep hill to climb. I would throw out a couple of factors. I think one is it is very hard to predict. It's actually impossible to predict member mood when post-election.
Yeah.
So I think this election will provide a narrative. It will put the members into a certain state of mind, and then they will make a calculus. I don't think that it's as much the policy on this one. I think the next year's tax discussion is much more challenging. I think it's more of a question of political will. Are both parties aligned with the notion that they want to clear the decks to some extent? And if they are, then I think they will come together on some deal. I think that's where we will be. I think it's hard to imagine. One factor that would be really, I think, dispositive is how clear are the election results in November. If we have a bunch of races hanging out there, if it's kind of really tight, then it's hard to imagine that members are going to be super focused on negotiating a package versus what's happening kind of in the broader political ecosystem. I would also say that and the reason negotiation is important, I don't think Smith-Wyden passes as is. I do think that serves as a base of a discussion. And then there are, there are tweaks, there are additions, et cetera, et cetera. I do think it is the starting point, but that is somewhat of a process. So it's certainly possible, but I do think that ultimately it comes down to political will. And if there's political will on both sides of the Capitol in both parties, then, or if there's, depending on what's at the top of the ticket, but I think it really is the bicameral, bipartisan calculus that ultimately drives the decision making.
I wanted to ask you both, how much do you think that the targeted tax ideas that have come out of the election are going to have legs after the election? So on the Republican side, or on both sides, the idea to exempt income from income taxes, the expanded newborn child tax credit that Vice President Harris has proposed. Is that the starting point for negotiations, or do you think that it's a clean slate?
Archie, you wanna? I mean, I'll just tell you, I have told all of our clients here at Millman Consulting that our retainers are $1, but there is a mandatory tip above that. So I figured I would hedge either way. I don't know if Archie's doing her contracts that way or not, but I just figured let's be just in case. I mean, listen, these are campaign promises. I think that's a tough one to do, right? There are a lot of Kyle talked about it in the last section a little bit at the end. I think that's just tough from a tax policy perspective, and then you start getting into the the enforcement mechanism issues. So how do you do trade-offs there? At the same time, could you see tweaks to SALT? That's not an easy issue for Republicans. We saw that this year, but it's also been a very, strong Republican position. So if there's a Trump administration, is there marriage penalty relief, at least in that area, right? So you could, but I think as you start getting through these, I'm going to throw Archie a little bit of hope here. I think the child tax credit pieces, something where, again, if you took two members that are more polar opposite, at least on paper, right, as Ron Wyden and Jason Smith in many ways. And I think Chairman Smith leaned way in and convinced his conference and did a great job getting an overwhelming majority of the Republicans and the entire House to go along with a fairly robust child tax credit in the House. So I think that's an area where we can see. Housing is going to be interesting. I think there's some room for some bipartisan work there. I think that the tip one that's a little bit more of a head scratcher for me.
Yeah, I think I would start with housing just because I do think on housing, there has been what I picked up kind of anecdotally across the country with various members and the Harris folks is that housing is bubbling up in a really significant way. But I would make the analogy to an introduction, a bill introduction. So and probably a little bit even I would maybe even a pre-introduction, but for today's purposes, let's say bill introduction, where there's a topic, there's a goal, and I think that represents what's happening on the campaign. And then the question becomes when one of these candidates wins is they will make an assessment on their early agenda and where are they going to double down. And then they're going to have two choices at that point. Do they work hand in hand with the Hill to facilitate a quick kind of, easy points on the board? Or do they develop their own policy and then start negotiating with the Hill as it goes forward? I think some of that will depend on the urgency that each incoming president feels in terms of kind of that early agenda. But I do think that campaign promises, I think they lay out priorities, they lay out intention, and then the question is, how do you bring those to life under real world parameters and real world rules where you're held accountable in a different way than you are on a campaign.
Speaking of real world, I've got to ask you both about SALT. I feel like leading up to TCJA, there was talk of even eliminating the deduction altogether. We got the $10,000 cap, and there's already been a lot of talk about raising that cap or even getting rid of it altogether. So where do you think that's going to end up?
I don't know that I would peg a number here, but I think something Archie said earlier about the economy and just sort of the disconnect between, how she sees the numbers and how people say they're feeling, right? I think this is also true of SALT, right? Where people, you can walk them through their tax situations and say, hey, you benefited. But all they know is like, yeah, but I lost this one big line item that was the biggest line item I had. And I think that's kind of the political struggles, right? And I think on the Republican side, you have such a belief in that it's the correct policy to even go as far as to fully eliminate it. But it runs into that political pressure. Obviously more important in, a few districts, those in New York and New Jersey and elsewhere. But, certainly if you're in divided government, that brings a whole lot more political pressures to sort of solve that issue. So, and we've seen the political pressures the Trump administration clearly felt in terms of trying to address that. So I'd be surprised if SALT stays the way it is today, but I don't think that's, I wouldn't wager a lot of money on that bet. I guess I'd put it that way, Tracy.
I am just noticing, I thought we had more time and we are almost out of time. So I think it's time for me to say thank you to you both for joining us. We could obviously go on and on. Just quickly, what's a sleeper issue that no one's talking about that might show up next year? 30 seconds or less, each of you. Archie, you start.
Wow, a sleeper issue. I think the sleep, oh wow, that, because I really wanted to talk about salt, so I'm gonna actually use my time for that. I think the sleeper issue on salt is that there's probably, there's an interesting set of bedfellows and partnerships that could emerge on salt. Is you do have, as you well know, Tracy, you have a lot of members on the progressive side who are not, who want, who would maybe be supportive of eliminating. So you could see a coalition there, but I do also think that if there is a smart political campaign behind the salt piece, I think that we could see that actually significantly change. So for me, the reason I would say it's a sleeper candidate is that they just have the salt's kind of coalition to change the cap and raise the cap has not been effective and not really moved the ball forward. So I think they will need kind of a campaign to get over the finish line. But on the other side, there's a really interesting counterbalance on the Republican side and progressive Democrats who may, be able to block that.
I'll be quick. Minimum taxes. That's my sleeper issues.
Very interesting. Okay, thank you both so much. And everyone, please do check out the resources on TPC's website, as Joe mentioned, and please do fill out that post-event survey. Let us know what you think, what other issues we should be looking at in these next very eventful 12 to 14 months. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.